Okay, guys, so we're back with the third and final segment of episode 8 of Pro Tools Authority. Let's start by discussing edit selections. So edit selections allow you to work on a specific point or within a specific portion of your track. You'll commonly see engineers making edit selections using their grabber tool or the selection tool. You can also use the edit selection fields in your edit window to make or modify edit selections. These edit selection fields are found to the right of the main and sub time counters in the middle of your edit window toolbar. So these fields are labeled with the text start, end, and length. So I'll show you that. So right here we have start, end, and length, and then these are the actual fields for the values for these parameters. If you have the link timeline and edit selection option in your options menu enabled, then you'll notice that a matching edit selection is made whenever you make any selection within your time-based ruler. But these are actually two separate edit types working in tandem. So I can kind of show you that. Let's see. So if I'm over here, I can click and drag in my rulers to make a timeline selection, but it's making an edit selection down here as well because they're working in tandem and vice versa. So anyway, you can also make an edit selection using your grabber tool. Just click once on a clip within your track playlist and an edit selection will be created that encompasses the entirety of that clip, and the clip will also become highlighted. So if we look at that, let me just zoom out so I can see a whole clip. I can click here and it will highlight that entire clip. You can also click on one clip and then hold shift and click on another clip to highlight multiple clips. And this will highlight the clips that you clicked on and the clips in between them. So let's look at that. Maybe I'll find, let me put this audio track into waveform mode really quickly so we can see that, because we have 3 clips here. You can see the boundaries right here. So I'm just going to select one and then I'm going to hold shift and then I'm going to select this far one and it selects both clips, the whole entirety of both clips and the space between them. So it includes the clip between them. So this selection method is great for deleting, cutting, copying, or moving clips from your track or tracks. You might also notice that if you're working with MIDI data on tracks that are in the notes view, then your grabber tool will easily select specific MIDI notes or note ranges. So let's look at that. I'm just going to move this into notes view because it's already a tall track. And let's see, I'm going to highlight or zoom in and then highlight. So I can grab a note and drag it around. I can move it around and just mess everything up. So if you want the grabber tool to grab MIDI clips like it does for audio clips, you'll first have to make sure that you've switched over to the MIDI clips view. So let's move it back into clips view. And now we have the whole MIDI clips. Then all you have to do is use the grabber to grab MIDI clips the same way that you would an audio clip. So again, we can just click and drag and move around the audio clip. I could cut, copy, paste, everything that you can do with the audio clip, right? So anyway, you can also select making an edit selection using your selector tool. And the selector tool is really useful because it can select any segment or portion of your MIDI or audio data that's on your tracks. All you have to do is make sure you're in the selector tool and then you click and drag over the segment that you want to select. It's very simple. So we have the selector tool here. I'm just going to click and drag and I can select any part of audio or MIDI clips that I want. You can also use the selector tool to click on a starting point for your selection and then hold shift and click on the end point for your selection in order to make any selection. So instead of clicking and dragging, I can click here, hold shift, and then click here, and it'll make my selection for me. You can also double click anywhere on a clip with the selector tool and it will highlight an entire clip. So that's another great trick if you're in the selector tool and you're not in the grabber tool, but you want to grab a whole clip, just double click and it'll get the whole clip. If you triple click with the selector though, then the entire tracks playlist will become selected. So triple click and it selects the whole track. Well, the whole playlist for the track, right? So once you've made your selection, you'll be able to see it highlighted. And this means that you can now delete, copy, cut, or move the segment of audio or MIDI data. Now, another way to make an edit selection involves using the edit selection fields. So these are found in the edit window. And again, they are found to the right of those main and sub time counters in the middle of your edit window toolbar. And they are labeled with start, end, and length. And these fields let you manually enter values to adjust or create a selection. So if you're making a new selection, just click on your start location indicator numbers in order to make them active. And you can then enter values for your start, end, and length values to create a selection. So just hit your return or enter key when you're done entering a value in order to confirm that selection. You can either type in the value you want and then hit enter. I'll show you that right now. So this is at 51 here. I'll just make a big change and do like 2. And then I hit enter and my start value is now all the way over here. Or you can also click in the field that you want to modify and then use the up and down arrows on your keyboard to change the value by 1 increment. So this is really, it's very useful when we're in bars and beats, because that can be much more applicable to your music. So if I want to move the start point back in the session in time, I can just hit the up value. And I'm actually going to zoom in so we can see that shift happen. Nope. Looks like it's not happening for some reason here. Oh, because I haven't hit enter yet. I'm sorry, guys. Let me hit enter here. And you can see it happen. So you can also use your left and right arrow keys to cycle through the different fields while you're doing this. So basically, if I click here again, I'm changing the values. I can type in a value. I can do the up and down to change the values. And then I decide I like that value, so I can hit the right arrow to move over or the left to move back and change them however much I want. And then I hit enter when I want it, when I know the value that I want, and I'm done. Excuse me. So you can also use your / key to rotate between your start and end and length fields. So if I'm in here, I'm moving about with my left and right arrow, up and down to change different values. I'm happy with my start point. I can hit this / key, and it will move to the end value. And now I can move within the end values. So you can actually set all these values using your keyboard. You just hit / to move between start, end, and length. And this works for both your edit selection fields that we're covering right now, and it works for the similar timeline selection fields, which are in your transport window. And another thing to note is that if you enter the start and end values, and then you don't need to actually specify the length value at all, because it will automatically update based on the start and the end values. Similarly, if you enter the values for the start and the length, then you don't need to update the value for end, because it will automatically update based on your start and your length values. Okay, so now let's talk about your timeline selections. Timeline selections set your range for playback and recording, but they're also commonly set using the selector tool. You can also create a timeline selection with the timeline selection fields within your transport window, or by using using your timeline selection in and out points in your main time-based ruler. So if you remember from an earlier episode, if you have the option for linked timeline and edit selection enabled in your options menu, then you can also make a timeline selection using the techniques we discussed for the edit selections, because they will be linked, right? Anyway, let's talk about using your time-based ruler to make the timeline selections. So to do this, simply select any of your tools and hover your mouse over a time-based ruler in your edit window, and you'll then see the selector tool become active. And remember, your time-based rulers are things like bars and beats, timecode 2, minutes and seconds, but it's not rulers like tempo, key signature, and meter. So just hover your mouse over a time-based ruler, and we will see that selector tool become active. You can see my mouse right here. Anyway, once you see the selector tool over the time-based ruler, you can just click and drag with that selector tool to create the selection that you want. So I'll click and drag. Now I have a selection. You'll see the selection highlighted in your time-based rulers, and you'll probably notice little blue flags at the beginning and the end points of your selection. These little flags will be red if a track is record enabled, and they are always displayed in the main time-based ruler. They are known as the timeline selection in and out points. You might also notice that your timeline selection will now be displayed in the timeline selection fields, which are found in your transport window. And they look a lot like your edit selection fields, and their values for start, end, and length. So I'm just going to open up that transport window to show you those. Excuse me. Might need some water here in a minute. I don't know why I'm coughing. So I'm going to open up that transport window. And you can see them right here. You have your start, your end, and your length. And then you have those values. And it's just like we saw earlier. Okay. Excuse me, guys. All right. So let's talk about making a selection with your timeline selection fields in your transport window. These fields are useful for manually modifying or creating a timeline selection. So just like with the edit selection fields, you simply click on the numbers to change the values, and then you manually type to enter the value that you want, or you use your up and down arrow to adjust the values by one increment. So I'll just kind of show you that that works. So left and right arrows to move about, up and down. I can type in new values. I'll type in a 6 here. So again, you can just use your left and right arrow keys to move between fields for each parameter. You can use the / to cycle through the parameters. And then you just hit enter when you're happy with your values that you have. So I'm just going to hit enter. And I'm all good. So some things to note about both the timeline selection fields and the edit selection fields. You might notice that if you type to enter a number in one of your selection fields, that Pro Tools will zero out any of the fields to the right of that field that you just changed. You can change a value without causing the other fields to the right of it to be altered, though, by using the up and down arrow keys instead. It's also good to know that your plus and minus keys let you perform calculator-like functions in these fields. So if you click in the field that you want to change, and then you hit plus or minus, depending on if you want to add or subtract, and then you enter the value by which you want to add or subtract, and then you hit enter, Pro Tools will actually run that calculation and enter the new value for you. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about your timeline selection in and out points. It's good to know that you can click and drag in the timeline selection on the timeline selection in and out points, which, if you remember, are those little blue flags in your rulers area, right? So you can do that to modify or create a timeline selection. So I had a timeline selection. Let me pull up a new one here. So here's my timeline selection. Here are those little blue arrows, or flags rather, right? And I can just click on one and drag it to change my selection. You can have any of your tools active when you're doing this, and you just hover over the timeline selection in or out point until you see the grabber become active, and then you click and drag like I just did. Okay, so now that we know how to make a selection, let's talk about working with these selections. There are some selection techniques that are more common than others, so let's talk about some of the common ones. So first of all, Pro Tools will have with the, I'm sorry guys. First of all, Pro Tools will have the link timeline edit selections option enabled by default. So if you open up Pro Tools and you're working, that will most likely be on unless you click to disable it. When this is enabled, these two types of selections are linked. So any edit selection made in your track playlist will update your timeline selection in your timeline and vice versa. They will move in tandem, right? So most of the time you will see engineers working in Pro Tools. This link timeline and edit selections option will be enabled. It usually just makes it easier to have your playback and your edit selections linked so that whatever you're working on with your edit selections will also be what you hear when you hit play. Sometimes, however, engineers will want to unlink these two types of selections. So you can do this by toggling this option off. So one way to toggle this option on and off is by finding it within your options menu. We can look at that really quickly. It's really easy to find. You just hit options and then it's link timeline and edit selection. So I could click here and that would disengage it or unlink these two things. However, you can also find the link timeline and edit selection button in your edit window toolbar. It's the button right below the grabber tool and to the right slightly from the grabber tool also. And it has two icons on it, one with two arrows pointing up and down and another with two parallel lines with one dot to the left and one dot to the right of them. So that's this button right here. So right now I have it engaged, so these two are linked, but I could click here to disengage it very easily and then re-engage it. So if this button is blue, then your timeline and edit selections are linked. And all you have to do is click on it to activate or deactivate your linked timeline and edit selection. So delinking these selections is rare enough that you can probably assume that we have them linked while we cover material in this course, unless I state otherwise. Okay, so let's talk about selecting material over multiple tracks. There are a few methods for doing this. So one way is to use your selector tool and click and drag to highlight, just like with a single track, and then you drag to include other tracks as well. So I'm going to click and drag, and then I'm going to drag over to other tracks. And it's just that easy to highlight over multiple tracks. But this way, we'll just highlight and select adjacent tracks. So you can highlight multiple non-adjacent tracks as well within Pro Tools. And to do that, you just make an edit selection on one track, and then you hold Shift and you click on a non-adjacent track. So I'll show you what that looks like. So I can highlight here and I can click over here and it highlights these two non-adjacent tracks and it doesn't highlight these ones between it. So there's also an option that's called link track and edit selection, which is not to be confused with link timeline and edit selection. So link track and edit selection makes it so that you can change which tracks are included in an edit selection by clicking on the track nameplate. So you can find and enable this option under your options menu. And you'll notice that the link track and edit selection is right below link timeline and edit selection. And you just click on it to check it off and enable it. So let's find this. Options, link track and edit selection. So I can link that very quickly. I'll leave this linked. Now, to make a track selection, you just click on the track's nameplate either in the mix or edit window. And that's what is meant by track selection, right? So if I click here, I've highlighted this track. It's that easy. That's a track selection. So now I've highlighted this track, right? So the default in Pro Tools for this option is link track and edit selection will not be enabled. But by this default, you can select a track in Pro Tools in order to bring that track into the focus for some track operations like deleting, making active or inactive, hiding, grouping, duplicating, and a lot more. But if you enable link track and edit selection under your options menu, then you'll notice that any tracks that you give an edit selection will also become selected by default. So I'll just make a quick edit selection somewhere besides this current track, and you'll notice that the track that I highlight on will also become, it will become highlighted. So now that track is selected because I made an edit selection on the track. You'll also notice that if you make an edit selection and then you click on the nameplate for a different track, that the same edit selection will then shift over to the track that you clicked. So if I click over here, my edit selection moves as well. And that's a function of this operation, or option, really. So also, just like the link timeline and edit selection, there's a button for link track and edit selection. So this button looks like a hamburger icon next to two parallel vertical lines with a dot to either side, and it's located below your scrub tool. So it's this one right here that I have my mouse next to. You can just click on it to disengage it or engage it. So if link, track, and edit selection is active, and your track selection, then your track selection is linked to your edit selection, then this button will be blue, right? So you just click on it to toggle the link, track, and edit selection option on and off. Okay, so that's all we have for today. But I hope there was some good information in there that you can use next time you use Pro Tools. So next time, we will continue discussing how to work with link, track, and edit selection enabled, and we will talk about other ways to improve your edit workflow and speed. We'll talk about things like tap to transients, more information on different session views, and details about your zoomer tools and your options. So we'll probably also talk about markers and memory locations in more detail, and then we'll get into some editing techniques. Anyway, I hope to see you guys here again soon, and thanks for watching Pro Tools Authority, and I'll see you guys next week.